As Thursday afternoon descended, fate dealt a cruel hand to the miners of the Noxman. Trapped in darkness, their desperate struggle unfolds beneath the Earth's unforgiving embrace as the Susquehanna River crashes upon them. This is the story of resilience in the face of gloom and tragedy.
On January 22, 1959, miners resumed work that morning at the River Slope mine owned by the Knox Coal Company. 81 of the miners entered the mine to work, and above them, the Susquehanna River at Port Griffith was flowing with a lot of force, even though it was covered with ice. Their goal was anthracite coal, and the order from their boss was to obtain as much anthracite as they could by digging at an upward angle of 35 feet toward the riverbed against the 50-foot limit. This was an illegal order. Before the day of this flood, federal, state, and county orders had been given to all mining companies in Pennsylvania to halt mining activities because of the increase in sea levels and some other associated dangers. However, with the decline in the coal industry, the companies were desperate and ignored these orders. That day, the 81 men were put into two groups and assigned to dig two different sections of the mine. One group comprised 6 men who went to work on the Pittston vein, and the others were to dig in the Marcy vein. At 11:20 a.m., 2 of the men digging at the site of the Pittston vein heard a cracking sound above them. Worried, they rushed to notify their assistant foreman John Williams, who was a part of the 6-man group. Williams quickly assessed the situation and decided it was beyond his control. So along with the first 2 men, they all left to notify Robert Groves, their superintendent. This left the other 3 men behind in the Pittston vein. They stopped their digging and waited anxiously for orders from their superintendent. On hearing about the situation, Groves immediately knew that this was a dangerous situation, but what he did next was a terrible mistake. In a bid to not cause panic, he downplayed the seriousness of the issue, but told the 3 men to ask every other mine worker to evacuate the mine. However, because of the failure to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation, the evacuation did not happen swiftly. So before the 3 men could reach their buddies still in the Pittston vein to notify them of the impending doom, they heard a roar like thunder at around 11:30 a.m. It was the crack directly below the river finally giving way to form a huge gash. Williams and the others retreated quickly out of the mine as they saw a heavy body of water pour down from the roof with so much force. As for the other men still in the vein, the icy water swallowed them in a matter of seconds. Guzzling the cold water and thrashing their limbs in an attempt to swim, they had no chance against the raging water. It carried them through the mine, bruising them against the rocky tunnels. With skulls cracking and flesh tearing, in no time, they were dead. The flood had taken its first lives, but it was aiming for more. It continued to fill the tunnels at a quick pace, tearing down the support beams and anything in its paths. Above the river, a huge whirlpool had formed so quickly that millions of gallons of water started flooding into the mine in a matter of seconds. Williams and the other 2 men were the first to exit the mine since they were closer to the exit where they had made the report to their superintendent. So this left 75 men remaining in the mine who were already on their heels in different directions looking for how to exit. There were at least 6 emergency escape routes from the mine. The 75 men were split into 3 groups without really knowing it, as they were all just looking for a way to escape. One group made of 33 men luckily made it to a shaft called the May Shaft, which leads from the mine. There, they quickly jumped into the elevator, which took them up to safety. But before others could find the shaft, the flowing water reached there first, filling the shaft with its rage. This left 42 men inside the mine who were split into 2 groups. One group was made up of 9 men and the other 33. The 9 men were looking for another shaft elsewhere when they encountered the fuming river approaching them. But before they could turn and run, the river caught them and it carried the men forward as it snaked through the tunnels, covering more and more space. The other 33 men were still far from the incoming waters, split into 2 groups while they were on their way to an abandoned shaft called the Eagle Air Shaft. One group comprised of 7 men led by Joe Stella, the Pennsylvania Coal Company surveyor who had a map of the mines and knew where the various escape routes were. The other group was led by another man named Myron Thomas. By this time, a lot of people, bystanders, family of the mine workers, officials, and many more had gathered outside the mine, waiting for the remaining men to emerge. Down below, the walls of the tunnels, not yet covered, were already vibrating as they awaited the inrushing water. Joe Stella's group was the first to reach the Eagle shaft, and though the water was still very much far behind, there was a huge problem. You see, the shaft was around 60 feet high, but worse, there was a significant amount of debris blocking the passageway of the shaft since it had been abandoned for a long time. So 3 men, including Joe Stella, left the group to look for tools to help them dig their way through the heaps of debris. But among the 4 left behind was a miner named Amedeo Pancotti. Pancotti didn't wait for his other companions to return with the tools, so with his hands he started digging through the dirt. After clearing out some, Pancotti was hit by a gush of wind. Finally, hope. The other men joined him, and together they cleared their way through the passageway of the shaft. They could see the sky, even though the surface of the shaft was 50 feet away from them. But this was the least of their problems because the walls offered little to no points for climbing. It was also very steep, and any attempts at climbing could lead to serious injury or even death depending on how far up one got before falling. So the men settled for shouting for help in hopes of getting heard by rescuers or anyone at least. Unfortunately, no one heard them. By this time, the vibration of the walls from the raging water was intensifying as many millions of gallons of water flowed through the whirlpool. Pancotti knew he had to do something or they would all drown. So in a leap of faith, he started to climb even after his companions advised against it. As expected, it was a tough climb. Pancotti could only really rely on very small rocky ledges to put his legs and hands on while pressing his body against the walls. He was also extremely careful not to mistakenly rest his hands or legs on the dirt and ice that also protruded from the walls. But after making his way 10 feet up, he encountered a huge problem. There was no more rocky ledge close by. He would either have to jump down or leap down to catch a protrusion that was very far from him. Neither option was possible. It looked like the climb had all been for nothing, but Pancotti was not a man that gave up so easily. Seeing a sapling grow out from the walls of the shaft, he grabbed onto it and put as little of his weight as possible, holding his breath. The sapling held, and with it, Pancotti made it up to a ledge. He eventually made it to the surface, where he shouted to observers on the surface to help the others below. The time was around 2:45 p.m. After Pancotti's alert, the rescuers were able to pull the other 3 men out of the shaft. Joe Stella and the other 2 men were rescued later on, but it wasn't until 6:45 p.m. that the other group of over 20 men were rescued. The other 9-man group was yet to make it out, and together with the first 3 that died, 12 miners were still considered missing. Their families were devastated, even though they had successfully retrieved 69 miners. The officials and the mine owners were still faced with 2 issues: recovering the 12 missing men and stopping the flood. The following day, on the morning of January 23, 1959, the Susquehanna River still had more than enough water to spare as long as the gash remained open below it. So to try to plug the whirlpool, which was now measuring 150 feet deep, several officials and workmen adopted desperate measures. One of the things they did was to cut one of the railroad tracks over the river and then bend it towards the whirlpool. This was done to push railroad gondolas into it to maybe plug it, but it wasn't enough. So they threw in other large materials, exhausting 50 hopper cars, thousands of bales of hay, hundreds of railroad titles, coal, dirt, and 400 mine cars into the whirlpool. But like a black hole, all of this was sucked into oblivion. They continued to throw more large stuff into it for the next 2 days until the hole was plugged to a reasonable extent. It was then water pumps were installed that they were finally able to stop the flowing water for good. But the 12 men were still never found, even up to this day. An investigation kicked off later, and 10 men were indicted, including the superintendent and a man named August Lippy, who was supposed to be the president of the mine workers. Lippy was a shareholder of the coal company, and it is believed he didn't look out for his own as a union leader because of the shares he held. Hence why the safety regulations had been ignored, leading to this disaster. The families of those who lost their lives would not be compensated until 4 years later, and many of those indicted were released on appeal while others served minimal sentences. The disastrous incident, no doubt, influenced a lot of mining laws and regulations that have gone on to save many lives since, but the family of the 12 men who died would be wishing these laws had come sooner.